Hi, today we're going to be talking about water and what it has to do with covalent bonds and hydrogen bonds, because water is a really important molecule to life, and sometimes it's hard to distinguish what the covalent bond or a hydrogen bond has to do with the molecule of water. And by the way, if you found this video to be of help, please do subscribe to my channel, and that will help other people find this video as well. So when we're talking about the important chemical bonds in biology, certainly we have many. We have ionic bonds, covalent bonds, hydrogen bonds, and forces like van der Waals interactions. Now, when we're talking about water specifically, there are two major bonds that are going to be involved: covalent bonds and hydrogen bonds. And covalent bonds are what is actually going to hold the water molecule together. We know the water is made up of one atom of oxygen and two atoms of hydrogen. So covalent bonds are going to hold the water molecule together. Now, we know that with a covalent bond, those atoms share the electrons between the different atoms. Now, the other important bond that we find that happens a lot with water is called a hydrogen bond. Okay, and hydrogen bond, rather than holding a water molecule together, hydrogen bonds are going to happen between different water molecules. Okay, and I'm going to break that down today because it's easy to get lost in all the details of this. I'm going to break it down so that you understand the difference and how both of these bonds are important with water. Okay, so here we see that these are the atoms that are found in water. In the center, we have oxygen, right? Oxygen has 8 protons, and so it has 8 electrons. And so we know that 2 electrons are going to be in the first shell, and that leaves 6 electrons in the outermost shell. Now remember, molecules and atoms are most stable when they have a full outer shell. So oxygen is going to participate in bonds so that it can hopefully share electrons from other atoms to fill that outer shell to a maximum of 8. Now, we have oxygen with 6 valence electrons. We also have 2 hydrogen atoms here. Hydrogen has 1 proton and it has 1 electron, okay? So again, the maximum in that first shell is 2 electrons. So hydrogen is going to participate in bonds so that it hopefully can have a full outer shell of 2 electrons. Okay, so oxygen has 6 valence electrons. Hydrogen has 1 valence electron each. Now, when those come together, we see that oxygen and those 2 hydrogens use covalent bonds to share their electrons. So oxygen here, right, which had 6 valence electrons, or 6 electrons in its outermost shell, well, now it's going to share that 1 electron that hydrogen has. So now hydrogen's electron is going to circulate around its proton, but it's also going to circulate around oxygen. And the same thing happens with the other hydrogen atom, that 1 electron is going to circulate around hydrogen, but it's also shared to circulate around oxygen as well. And the inverse is true too, that oxygen will have an electron that is shared with hydrogen, each of these hydrogen molecules. And so the hydrogens will have a full outer shell of 2 valence electrons as well. So this is what a covalent bond is, right? It is a bond between 2 different atoms where they share electrons. And it's a very strong bond because neither one of those atoms wants to give up that electron, that extra electron that it has. And so think about this, though. Oxygen is a bigger atom than hydrogen is. Hydrogen has 1 little proton, 1 little positive charge in its atomic nucleus. Oxygen, on the other hand, has 8 protons, so it has 8 positive charges in its nucleus. So that 1 electron that's being shared with each of these hydrogens, well, that electron is actually going to be attracted to those 8 positive charges in oxygen's atomic nucleus. So oxygen essentially pulls on that electron more often than hydrogen can. Now, a good analogy for this is like, think of 2 kids. You have a big kid and a little kid, and they're fighting over a toy. And in this case, the big kid is oxygen and the little kid is hydrogen. And that toy is the electron that they're sharing. So oxygen can pull that toy, right? The big kid is able to pull the toy more often. The little kid will get it back sometimes, but the big kid is going to get that toy more often. And that's what happens here with that electron that's being shared with both of these hydrogen atoms. That oxygen is actually going to possess that electron circulating around it more frequently than that electron will circulate around hydrogen. Well, why is that important? That's important because that electron is negatively charged. So if the electron circulates more frequently around oxygen, well, it's actually going to have a slightly negative charge because it has those extra electrons circulating around it more frequently. And if hydrogen loses its electron more often to oxygen, the bigger kid in this analogy, well, hydrogen then is more often going to have just that one proton and not the electron circulating around it. And so the proton is positively charged. So without that electron being fairly shared, hydrogen will be slightly positively charged most of the time. So what we end up having here is this water molecule, as we see here, H2O, and the oxygen side of it is slightly negative, and the hydrogen sides of it are slightly positive. And so what we have here is known as a polar molecule. Okay, and we're going to talk about that more in a second. Now, I want to mention that sometimes when you see this represented maybe in books or online, you might see this little delta associated with different parts of the molecule. The delta refers to a dipole, right? A dipole is defined as a molecule that has a positive end and a negative end. And because that electron circulates more frequently around oxygen, oxygen is slightly negative. So water is actually a dipole where there's a slightly negative end and a slightly positive end. So they use this delta to signify which one is the negative end and which one is the positive end. Okay, so oxygen, that side of the water molecule, that atom is going to be the slightly negative part, and then the hydrogens are going to be the more positive part. Now, when you have a molecule that has a negative and a positive end, like this dipole, it's known as polar. Okay, polar means there are definite ends or sides to the molecule. Where do you hear polar before? Maybe like the Earth, right? The Earth, you have the North Pole and the South Pole, right? You have the two definite ends. Or a battery. A battery has a positive end and a negative end. So a battery is something that is polar as well. And water is also polar because the oxygen is slightly negative and the hydrogens are slightly positive. It's really as simple as that, okay? Some molecules, when they come together and form these covalent bonds, they're non-polar. That means there's no positive end and no negative end. So if two oxygen molecules come together to form O2, what we breathe, right? Two oxygen molecules, they're the same size kid. So they're going to equally share that electron. Okay, same thing with like carbon and oxygen. They're about the same size, so they equally share that electron. But when you have unfairity like this, where oxygen is much bigger and attracts that electron more often, well, then you get different ends, right? And because that electron is negatively charged, oxygen is going to be slightly negative charged because it has the electron more frequently than the hydrogens do. So water is a polar molecule. And that actually helps. We'll talk about it in other videos, but because it's polar, that actually helps it dissolve things, for instance, and we'll explain how that works in other videos. Now, one other thing I want to introduce, because you might hear it when we're talking about this topic, is electronegativity. And electronegativity is just the capability of an atom to attract electrons to itself. So let me ask you a question here. Of oxygen or hydrogen, which one is more electronegative? Okay, oxygen or hydrogen, which one is more electronegative? Okay, the answer is oxygen, which you probably got because we talked about it, right? Electronegative, the electronegative atom is the one that's going to be able to attract the electron with a greater force. And that's oxygen here. Oxygen with its 8 protons, those 8 positive charges in its atomic nucleus, is able to attract that electron more strongly than the hydrogen atoms are. Okay, so electronegativity just refers to the ability of an atom, like oxygen or fluorine or carbon or hydrogen, to attract electrons to itself. So we end up here with water molecules. Okay, a water molecule uses covalent bonds to bond together, right? Those two hydrogens in the oxygen molecule, and they form polar covalent bonds because that sharing of the electron in the covalent bond is not fair. It's not equally shared. Okay, so before we go on to talk about what a hydrogen bond is and what hydrogen's bonds have to do with water, I want you to stop the video and say this sentence out loud at least 10 times, right? That's so you can get it into your memory. And maybe later today too, like hours from now, say it out loud a couple times to remind your brain. that a water molecule is held together by polar covalent bonds. Okay, it's a covalent bond because the hydrogens and the oxygen share their electrons, and it ends up being polar covalent bonds because remember, there's unfair sharing of that electron. So say this out loud at least 10 times. A water molecule is held together by polar covalent bonds. And it's important to remember this because when we talk about hydrogen bonds, that's something that has to do with water as well. And we don't want to get hydrogen bonds mixed up with these polar covalent bonds that hold together a water molecule. So here we have two molecules of water, right? With each one has one atom of oxygen and two atoms of hydrogen. And we know that a water molecule is held together by a polar covalent bond. And it's polar, so that means that the two ends of the molecule are slightly charged, right? There's one end that's slightly negatively charged, and that's the oxygen. And the other ends are the hydrogens. Those are slightly positively charged. Now, if you forget which end is which, just reason it out, right? You know that oxygen is a bigger atom. So it's 8 protons. It has more protons, more positive charges. It's going to essentially attract that electron that's being shared by hydrogen more frequently. Okay, so if you forget which is the slightly negative end and which is the slightly positive end, just try to reason it through and remember that it's about sharing of that electron and that oxygen is the bigger kid here, right? It attracts the electron more frequently with a greater force. Now, these two water molecules are held together within themselves by polar covalent bonds. What a hydrogen bond is it's a weak attraction between two different water molecules. So again, one water molecule is held together by a polar covalent bond, but two water molecules have a weak attraction to each other, right? We know that opposites attract. So what happens here is that slightly negative oxygen in the water molecule has a slight attraction to the slightly positive hydrogen atom in another water molecule. Okay, so hydrogen bonds are an attraction between two different water molecules. Each water molecule is held together by a polar covalent bond, but a hydrogen bond is a weak attraction between different water molecules. So if we want to think about this, hydrogen bonds are intermolecular bonds. And in fact, I'll tell you that chemists generally don't call these bonds. They call them forces or attractions. So they're intermolecular attractions. Inter meaning between. So the internet is the network between various locations in the world. International means between different nations. Okay, so inter means between, and the hydrogen bond is an intermolecular bond. It happens between different molecules. Now, on the other hand, covalent bonds are intramolecular bonds, like an intranet, right? If a company has an intranet, then it's just the internet. It's just a network within its own company. Or maybe you've heard of like intracellular things, right? That means within the cell. But if you have intercellular things going on, then those are interactions between two cells. So covalent bonds, remember, the water molecule is held together by a polar covalent bond, but hydrogen bonds can happen between different water molecules. So that's what a hydrogen bond is. And why do we call it a hydrogen bond? We call it a hydrogen bond because hydrogen is often part of this attraction. Because hydrogen, with its one little electron, often has it shared unfairly. And so hydrogen is often slightly positive, right? And so hydrogen is often part of these hydrogen bonds. And in this case, the hydrogen bond happens between hydrogen in one water molecule and oxygen in the other water molecule. Okay, here's a question for you. Pause the video if you can and see if you can answer the correct statement here. The question is, which of the following is true about hydrogen bonds? A says a hydrogen atom donates an electron to another atom. B says a hydrogen atom attached to an electronegative atom in one molecule is attracted to an electronegative atom in an adjacent molecule. C says a hydrogen atom creates a covalent bond with another atom. And D says a hydrogen atom inherits an electron from another atom. So which of these is true about what happens in a hydrogen bond? Okay, let's break these down. I wanted to put in a question like this because if you happen to be taking an exam somewhere, it's probably going to be worded more like this. So let's break down what all of these different statements say. Okay, A says a hydrogen atom donates an electron to another atom. Does that happen in a hydrogen bond? The answer is no. There are no atoms that are given from that hydrogen atom. And in fact, if we think about hydrogen atoms giving or donating electrons to another atom, well, that's what happens if hydrogen participates in an ionic bond. Okay, so that first statement A is talking more about ionic bonds, not hydrogen bonds. Let's look at the second one. Oh, this is a long one. Let's break it down. A hydrogen atom attached to an electronegative atom in one molecule is attracted to an electronegative atom in an adjacent molecule. Okay, so this is where we have to go back and think of what electronegative means. Electronegative means that that particular atom is able to more strongly attract the electron. So let's break this down into two parts. A hydrogen atom attached to an electronegative atom in one molecule. Okay, do we have that with water? Is there a hydrogen atom attached to an electronegative atom? And the answer is yes, that part is true. So let's see. That hydrogen atom is attached to oxygen. And oxygen is an electronegative atom because it can attract that electron more strongly than the hydrogen can, okay? So within water, oxygen is electronegative and it attracts the electron that the hydrogen atoms have. Okay, so a hydrogen atom attached to an electronegative atom in one molecule is attracted to an electronegative atom in an adjacent molecule. So let's think back to our example about water, right? Water, we have two molecules of water. And so the hydrogen atom in this molecule of water is attracted to an electronegative atom in an adjacent molecule. Well, so if we have two molecules of water, and we know oxygen is the electronegative part of that, the electronegative oxygen, what this sentence is saying is that hydrogen in one water molecule is attracted to oxygen in the other water molecule. And that's true, okay? So that is true about hydrogen bonds, that hydrogen in one molecule has a slightly positive charge, and so it's attracted to a slightly negative atom in an adjacent molecule. And that's an important part, adjacent molecule, right? It's not within that one molecule because we know water is held together by polar covalent bonds. But when we're talking about two different molecules, well, now they can have hydrogen bonds between them. Let's go through C and D and see why those are not true. Okay, C, a hydrogen atom creates a covalent bond with another atom. Well, that's not a hydrogen bond, right? That's going to be a covalent bond. And that's what holds water together, our polar covalent bonds. Okay, and the last one says a hydrogen atom inherits an electron from another atom. Well, that doesn't happen here, right? There's no situation here in a hydrogen bond where a hydrogen atom receives an electron from another atom. So the answer here is B. And let's look again, just to summarize what hydrogen bonds are. Now remember, we have two water molecules here, and the water molecules are held together by polar covalent bonds. The oxygen and the hydrogens bond together using polar covalent bonds. Now, what are hydrogen bonds? Well, because oxygen is more electronegative, right, it's going to attract hydrogen's electrons more frequently. And because those electrons are negatively charged, oxygen within a water molecule is going to be slightly negatively charged because it has the electrons more frequently than hydrogen does. So the slightly positively charged hydrogen is attracted to the slightly negatively charged oxygen in an adjacent molecule. And that's what the hydrogen bond is. Now, hydrogen bonds are comparatively weak, right? Those covalent bonds are really strong. Hydrogen bonds are kind of weak bonds, between these slightly positive and slightly negative atoms of adjacent molecules. But they are really important in biology. Proteins, for instance, form structures like an alpha helix or a beta pleated sheet. Partially, they keep those structures because of hydrogen bonds between different molecules interacting. Another one is DNA. We know that DNA is a double helix, so that means it has two strands, right? It kind of looks like a ladder where there are the two strands, and each end of the ladder is made up of sugars and phosphate groups. And then in between are the bases, the nitrogenous bases of DNA. So it looks like a ladder, and then it twists. Well, those two ends of the ladder would actually fall apart without hydrogen bonds. It's hydrogen bonds that keep the two strands of DNA together. So here we've zoomed in to a part of the DNA molecule. We see on the left side here, this is that sugar, phosphate, sugar, phosphate, sugar, phosphate backbone. The sugar phosphate backbone is made up of phosphate groups and the sugar, which is deoxyribose. Now from that sugar into the middle of the DNA, that's where those bases are, like adenine and cytosine and guanine and thymine. And so there are bases on one strand of the DNA, and there are bases on the other strand of the DNA as well. And it's hydrogen bonds that hold those bases together. So adenine on one strand creates hydrogen bonds with thymine on the other strand, and that forms a base pair. And the reason that they stay together is because there are hydrogen bonds between the adenine and the thymine that are keeping them together. And similarly, cytosine and guanine form hydrogen bonds with each other, and that's why they form a base pair. So cytosine on one strand, guanine on the other strand, there are 3 hydrogen bonds that connect those two together. In adenine and thymine, you can see there are 2 hydrogen bonds that keep those together. So whereas covalent bonds are really strong bonds, it's hard to break up a piece of a water molecule, right? It's hard to break up a water molecule. These hydrogen bonds are weak, but they're actually really important to add structure to biological molecules like DNA or proteins. So here's another example and an illustration of where we see these hydrogen bonds, right? We have 5 different water molecules here. The oxygens are red, the hydrogens are in white. So the oxygens are slightly negatively charged, the hydrogens are slightly positively charged, and so we see these hydrogen bonds forming between adjacent molecules. And it's really interesting because this is a cool property of water. When you put a lot of water molecules together, they form like a water lattice where we have all of these hydrogen bonds between the different water molecules that help to form structure and keep the water together. This property of water, that water molecules will form adjacent interactions with each other using hydrogen bonds, is really important for life here on Earth. It helps to explain things like surface tension or why it takes a lot of energy to raise the temperature of water.